My name is Felipe Chiarello, and I'll be conducting the work today. This is the last day of our meeting, and we will open for the professor, the first professor to speak today is Professor Claudia Curiel Leidenz. The Universidade Católica Andrés Bello.
Talk about the Venezuelan process and the competition policy matters and what is happening to the market is a very relevant and special issue for us now. And I think that also is an interesting subject to the research and to the reflections of lawyers, politicians, economists, and well, the academic society as well. So I will start with preliminary remarks. The start point for us is the competition law that was enacted in a process of reforms in the early 90s, and we have in this sense, two main pieces of the competition system in Venezuela: the law for the promotion and protection of free competition and its regulations, and the superintendency for the promotion and protection of free competition. Both were influenced by the European system and the European agencies, especially German and Spain, and by the United States and Canada agencies. So the agency learned a lot, and I think that 10 years after the foundation of the superintendency, the Venezuelan experience was rich. We have something to show in competition matters. Maybe in the enforcement and in the advocacy, the both areas were attending very much, especially the administrative investigation of cartels, unfair competition practices, abuse of dominant, and mergers. And in the side of the competition advocacy, the promotion and education on competition policy principles, especially to the governmental practitioners that were cartelization advocacy that may be very impressive. But at the end of the 19th, and if we go to the beginning of the O's, first of all, we have the positioning of the competition issues was a relevant factor in several areas of public policies. We had access to ministers, to other regulatory agencies, and the ability and the skills to influence the design of public policies was usual in Venezuela at this time. I think that this is the main characteristic, the trained and experienced staff of the superintendency. We were export to other countries. When I left the superintendency, I was involved in the formation of competition agencies in at least other 5 countries in Latin America. So this is part of the process. But I have good news about the present. We have new paradigms in Venezuela. We have a fight, a very strong fight between the state and the market. First of all, the state wants to if, for example, they question why the ladies want to make aesthetic surgeries. It is not a business for a government, but they have an opinion about that. The entrepreneurship has a monopolistic motivation and a speculative nature. It means you are not maximizing, you are not rational decision maker, you are a speculator. Just that. And it is modeling the culture of the society. Consumers need overprotection. If you don't need the debt of a product and you have a misuse of that, you keep your right to go against the provider. The autonomy has no sense if you are not capable to take decisions aligned with social interest. You don't deserve autonomy. And I will show what it means in the practice. The market is understood as a space of cooperation. The only public speech that I heard from the current authority, he said, we are not talking about competition, it has no sense. We have to understand the market as a space of cooperation. It is textual, it is not a metaphor from me. The only, one of the statements, I think that against all the way is that you have to produce not to gain money, just to attend social needs. It is in laws that now, in the speeches from the President Chavez and the ministers, when something say to an entrepreneurship, you don't have to make money. You are intervening all the rationale of the businessman. And the last line is the property have a social role. If you need the property to make money, you are against the social needs. So I can intervene the property. And these points derive in that the basics of competition policy doesn't have sense, doesn't have a space in Venezuela now. In these paradigms, you cannot talk about the dynamic of the market. They are not capable to understand what it means. The incentive schemes doesn't recognize the self-regulation of the economic agents. I don't know, I will not impose a fine or a legal framework to motivate you. I will punish you. I will impose extreme penalties. Venezuela is the only country in the world where an economic fault is sanctioned with expropriation. The expropriation is a sanction. It's not a procedure like in the rest of all other countries in the world. So we are unique. And the monitoring of the market was disposal, and the main course of action is the criminal prosecution, but of every decision that could not be aligned with social goals. So it is a large text, but I will not read that. I just want to refer three facts. First of all, between 1999 and today, more than 300 laws, decrees, and regulations were created regarding the private economic activity. It is impossible to know, to read, and to apply 300 laws. And maybe you say, well, at what rate the National Assembly is producing laws in Venezuela? Well, 70% of these 300 were produced under enable laws. It means that the president is making laws at this rate. And he's making, including organic laws, not just ordinary laws. Secondly, these legal changes are supporting the building of private property relative. It means you can hold the private property relative to the social goals that are associated with that. And these social goals are established not by the court, are established by the community or by the governmental officer. So if you see the market in my words, please let me know, because I think that this appeared a long time ago. And the other issue that I want to comment before to describe this madness is the continuing implementation of strategies that have been applied in relation to productive activities. First of all, there is increasingly less opportunity for the market to function. Secondly, the state is building up a bureaucratic, technological, and I separate the institutional components that are at the first that we can study. And I study the treatment of the private proper activity guarantees the scope of the right to exercise economic freedom, the state's structure and deployment, and the instruments applied to the implementation of public policies. So what are the common elements between the laws and public policies that I classify as institutional components of the VSIP? First of all, that they generate institutional risk. If you have a proliferation of laws, if you don't have accountability, if you have this issue is very serious, the revolutionary justice principle. This is a principle in the Plan of National Development that establishes that the social goal is over the formality of the law. It means if you have to decide something, do not wait for the law is enacted, you can proceed. And it is a business as usual in Venezuela now. The second common factor is that generate transaction cost. The largest enterprises have units advocated to the monitoring of the legal framework and the decision of the policy makers that are not in the same way all the time. In third place, the higher exposure to the discretion. We cannot expect an officer of the National Guard understand the cartelization or can understand when the revenue rate is high or not, but they do. There is a bias in favor of large enterprises. The small and medium enterprises cannot deal with that. It is impossible. They are very close to the closer point. And last term, you are destroying the trust in institutions and the predictability of the legal system. If you have this part of the BC, I don't pretend you to read that. It will be available for you. I made a punctuation to determine which of these initiatives or laws are more serious, affecting the Venezuelan system, and the number one is expropriation. So I will dedicate some seconds to that point later. And the second is a law for fair cost and prices that is new. and they are pretending to include all the products of the economy in a system, in a platform, IT platform, and with all your cost. And the cost of all the commercial chain in order to control everything. I think that the platform will be, maybe if it functions properly, they will arrive to a planning system that they have in the mind. But if the platform fails, they will stop of this line of action. The second area, I call it the shift of private actors and imposition of restraint. It means the state wants to control everything, but being the main factor, not just regulating others. And the concern here is the diversity of ways that has taken the state to intervene in economic scope. So the characteristic of the laws that I am taking in this part is that the entrance of new actors with advantages. If you are a company, and a state-owned company, you don't have to, to present or to approve the test, for example, in labor safety. They don't care about you. But if you are private, you can have fiscalizations every week. A client of mine, last year, in 1 year, he had 272 fiscalization or supervisory visits. So they work to attend governmental officers. And he asked, well, in what time I will produce money? The second is raising labor cost in very, very different ways. The third is moving resources inherent to the usual course of the activity to attend the model. The fourth is suppress the access to infrastructure or public goods. If you need the provision of raw material from a state-owned enterprise, you have to be okay with the government. And it implies to be not just in compliance of the laws. There are another requirements. And in the fifth place, law of export market. The Venezuelan government have signed over 1,300 bilateral agreements with other countries, and in these agreements they exchange oil for merchandises, but anyone have compromises of the other countries to receive Venezuelan exports. And in last place, okay, thank you. The control of several matters, the loss of autonomy. If you have control your revenue rate, your prices, the mobilization of your merchandise, your autonomy is closing and is almost will disappear. I feel that soon. There's a list, again, it will be available for you. But I want to resume all the laws in this graphic. I will not read everything. I will let there appear until the end. Well, the market almost disappeared, but if you consider the 300, I am sure that it will. But this is a besiege. This is a daily way, the way to deal of the Venezuelan enterprises. If you are in the industrial sector, in the service sector, in the agricultural sector. But I have to consider two facts. First of all, that more than half of the industrial units have disappeared. in Venezuela. It means that the concentration of market is higher. And the second point, maybe could surprise you, is that last year, including with the besiege, the most part of the large company, they had a record of income in Venezuela. So we cannot understand. They are earning a lot of money. So the political economy of this process is very strange because a lot of people doesn't have incentive to remove the system. They are making money as never before. It is complemented with the supervision of economic activity. Just to show you in a visual way, in the superior area will be the regulatory entities that are operating in Venezuela. In the green area will be the inventory of matters subject to fiscalization. And in the black line will be the spectrum of sanctions. And this is a kind of, this is a synthesis of all that I am telling to you. But this is the characteristic of our system. If you introduce a competition policy in this area, you won't see that. It cannot function. And it is the main of my motivation to come here. But there is another fact that I want to show. I have 5 minutes? Okay, thank you. Sources and motivations for state size expansion. The main instrument is the expropriation. We have more than 1,200 expropriations in Venezuela until now, from 2004. I tried to compare the motivations because it is very important to understand what is pretending the state with these decisions. First of all, the whole activities in Venezuela, all the assets that are allocated to produce commercialization or distribution were declared as public activity. And so they are, they don't need the expropriation process, administrative procedure previous to the declaration of the expropriation. But they have no trials. If the president announced that they will take a firm, the National Guard will appear in few hours and will take it, and you will not be able to enter anymore. So you will negotiate it, but the motivations are what is relevant for us now. In blue is the expansion of state operative capacity. If you read the decree, the expropriation decree, for example, of a plant of dairy, it will mean it is necessary to expand the governmental capacity to produce dairy. That in that terms, clear. The second area is the red one, that is the expropriation of buildings and urban spaces because they have to build homeland to everybody. And the yellow area is turn an activity to the exclusive scope of the state. That is the control of state driver. But if you analyze that, you see that the expropriation is an instrument, not is a reason of a state. It is not a particular case of or an extraordinary circumstance explaining this kind of decisions. So we have to say that the expropriate agenda is transversal to the overall economy. All these sectors have been affected by these kind of decisions, and these rationales that it's explained by the government exceeds the organization of the subject. Well, at least the reasoning in other countries. The law of expropriations is not the fundamental of the decrees, are other laws, the environmental law, the law of emergency in building, the law on security, alimentary security and sovereignty, and other laws. And the most important factor is a social goal. There is a social need that justifies the state to make this kind of intervention. Well, in conclusion, the core of the expropriations is far away from the raising of efficiency, the implementation of a strategic plan, or the execution of any proposal to enhance the Venezuelan economic quality. So I am asking if after this very fast overview of the Venezuelan institutional framework, we have a space to expect that competition policy agenda is or not surviving. I think that it's died. But the more important question is, wow, help me to think how can we return to a path of normality? Because if in 1991 we had anything in competition policy, but currently we are far away from this point. We wish to be in 1991, but we are maybe in 19th century. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Procedure with Professor Arthur Barrionuevo Filho from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. You have the word for 30 minutes, please.
I will talk about a different kind of government intervention on the regulatory agency. It was a kind of what we call capture, but very soft compared to Venezuela. What happened? The problem was a public consultation about the regulation of pay TV service. And as the Brazilian government has the interest to increase the number of subscribers of broadband, the Brazilian government pressured Anatel to change the rules of pay TV, to increase the investment of cable operators, not to increase the pay TV service, but to increase the broadband subscribers. Then here we'll talk about this public consultation, the normative suggestion that Anatel did, and the questionnaire that's important because it was the instrument to increase the investments. What we did, me and Pedro Dutra, that is another author, and he's a lawyer, was to show the problems in the law and the problems in economic efficiency caused by this possibility of to put liabilities, investment liabilities on companies, even in the companies that are already operating in the market. And then we have a conclusion. to analyze these economic effects, we developed two models, and I'll try to show the effects, the results of this kind of measure. Well, the public consultation of Anatel, it was from December 19, last year. It's the consultation number 65. And this proposed regulation was a regulation of SEAC. That's a new law here in Brazil to regulate the provision of pay TV in all technologies, cable, DTH, satellite, and the others. This consultation had a questionnaire when Anatel expected feedback from society to impose commitments. It's strange, impose commitment on companies, big companies. What kind of impositions? The number of households that a company should attend to have the license to operate. Why? Because they wanted to encourage investments in cable telecommunications to contribute to the expansion of broadband in Brazil. The main problem here is that Anatel doesn't have the function to stimulate investment in broadband when it is regulate the pay TV service. We will see in the next section that this caused legal uncertainty over the companies that uses cable as a means to supply pay TV service. Well, first of all, the questionnaire doesn't comply with the LGT, that's our telecommunications law, and because the telecommunications law doesn't have criteria and doesn't create obligations of this kind over the suppliers of the service. Here we have a difference. We have some telecommunication services that are public service. In this case, the state can impose some obligations to the company, to the companies. When the service is a private service, the law doesn't permit the regulatory agency or the government to impose goals to the companies. Well, the questionnaire had a lot of proposals, but the most important and the proposal that we talk here, we analyze here, is the necessity of investments. And then we will see these items, no? The model and the contradiction and opposition to the law of the propositions contained in this questionnaire. Well, it has a conflict with the legal system because it had a minimum number of households that would be set by the regulator that the company should serve. And it's strange, too, in our system of regulation that one rule would be done as a result of a questionnaire that the society decides what should be done by the companies. Then it's a kind of a populism that is not usual here in Brazil when you do the regulatory process. Well, the economic effects of the proposal. This is the part I know well. And what is interesting It's even if Anatel and the government wanted the companies to invest more as a result of these rules, the result would be the opposite. What would happen is that the companies would invest less than if they don't have any obligation, any liability. How we reach this conclusion? We used two models. The first model is if the government opened the license to everyone that wants to invest, because the license was, or the process of new license was closed by Anatel by 10 years. And what would happen in Brazil if everybody could have a license? And the first model show what municipalities would receive new entrants. The second, we took these municipalities that would receive private investments, and we show what would happen if these companies in these municipalities were obliged to supply a certain number of households. Then first in the market effects. Well, the law has as objectives the technological neutrality and incentives for investments. But the questionnaire doesn't follow these principles, because it has not technological neutrality, because only the cable companies were obliged to invest, and it doesn't create incentives for investments. Okay, the model. Market incentives to entry. Another economist, Claudia and I, used the Bresnahan and Rice methodology to determine where the most likely cities for companies to enter the local markets of pay TV service. This model uses costs and demand variables to determine the profit per user that you have in every city. Then if you have positive economic profits, certainly in that city, you have an incentive to a new entrant. And then we used variables like the average income, the number of households of high income like classes A and B, etc. In the costs, we used a variable like the number of inhabitants by square kilometers. Then it's possible to determine that in a given region, if it's possible that the entry of a particular number of companies. Well, what was the results we had? In the majority of Brazilian municipalities that don't have any cable operator, probably the liberation of license would have no effect. Only 3 million of inhabitants, or 15% of 20 million who are currently unattended, would receive a new entrant. And from this 85%, 18 million people, you have to sum 45 million that are in cities who have less than 20,000 inhabitants. And these cities are not economic attractive for the cable operators. Then from 66 million inhabitants, only 3 million would have, by private investment, access to cable to pay TV service or broadband. This 3 million is the subject of the second study we did. We pay the 108 cities where these 3 million live, and we, using the data from Net Service, which is our main cable operator, we used the revenue for households of classes A, B, and C, where the subscribers are, and the costs to provide the service, including to classes D and E that don't use this service. Then you have the follow situation. Classes A, B, and C pay for the service. They create a profit margin a positive profit margin, and the classes D and E in every city, they only generate costs for the operators. Then what we did, every class has an average contribution margin, positive, A, B, and C. Then we had an hypothesis that, first of all, you attend the class A, second B, C, D, and E. And we saw what happens if you oblige the companies to attend a high percentage of the households in every of these cities, in 108 cities. And you have this situation. If the company is obliged to cover 10% of the households, well, then the investment will be in the 180 cities. When the percentage of households covered increases, what happened? The number of the cities that it's attractive to new investments decreases. Then when you have, for example, 50%, 50%, you have 16 cities without new investments, because the companies will not invest in cities where they will have negative profits, losses. With 80% of households, you have 109 cities without new operator. And with 100%, you have 165 cities without any new entrant. Yeah, and here you have the sum of positive profits and the sum of negative profits. Then this proposed rule of Anatel may be considered illegal and is inefficient because it reduces the investment and it doesn't contribute to the Brazilian government objective to increase the supply of broadband service. Well, this is only an example. We use only the data from one company, one cable operator, the Net Service, but this is the main cable operator here in Brazil, and they have 40% of market share. Then these are representative data from revenues and costs. This data show that classes A, B, and C buy the services, and classes D, E, practically nobody of these classes of income, D and E, buy because they don't have the money to pay for the service. Then the compulsory coverage index will have negative effects on investment decisions. And if the Anatel's objective is to maximize the number of municipalities with TVC providers, the market itself without any obligation or compulsory obligation is capable of stimulating entry in the municipalities. Then, in some cities, you could have a cable operator, even if in the start it only would supply to the classes A, B, and C. Then even these classes will not have a new operator. And if the index, the coverage index exceeds 30%, the negative effects will be very present. Well, the second argument about this tentative of the government to force the Anatel to impose investment obligations is the opposition to the law, the Telecomunications law. The problem is that when Anatel is looking for a commitment, it cannot be an imposition. The problem here, too, is that they wanted to impose these investment liabilities even in companies that are already operating in the cities here in Brazil. Then if you don't comply with the percentage of households that Anatel could consider as adequate, what would happen? The government could impose a fine in these companies. Well, commitment presumes a free manifestation of intent. This is not an agreement. And there's a unilateral aspect of this rule that has a coercive nature. Then, even if the government wants to universalize the broadband service, and this is correct, this is a public policy that the majority of countries is looking for nowadays, the instruments that the government intends to use are not first correct because they are unlawful. Second, they have as consequence, economic consequence, effects that are the contrary to the objective of the government. Well, like as my time is finishing, and then I'd like at least to see the conclusions. First, the imposition of investments would contradict the economic order in the Brazilian Constitution. It's the state's duty to regulate and monitor economic activity, always in accordance with the law. And this kind of plebiscitary regulation is not accord with the law. In the same direction, to impose agreements with the parties is not in accordance with the law. What would happen more than this? You would have a problem with the competitive structure. Why? Because in the pay TV services, we have companies with different technologies. The satellite DTH that doesn't have any obligation of investment, and cable operators that, by this rule, would have investment obligations. Then you would, this rule would cause an asymmetry in the competition process that would favor the companies that use DTH when compared with the cable operators. the result would be a decrease in supply of pay TV by cable operators. As cable operators are the same who supply broadband service, the problem is obvious. The economic effect of the implementation of the measures would be negative. The imposition of coverage would prevent investments in municipalities which were economically attractive to a new entrant. Then even that 3 million or 180 cities where the private sector could provide the service would be reduced depending on the index imposed. The law of pay TV doesn't allow the imposition of obligations in terms of coverage, because this law was enacted exactly to finish the difference between the technologies, and the regulation of Anatel, influenced by the government, tried exactly the opposite. Well, this is the situation, and this tale had a happy end because the Anatel, in public hearings, accepted the private sector and specialists' opinion, and give up and decide not to impose investment obligations over the companies, the cable operators. Thank you very much.
In my understanding, maybe this kind of initiative, the comprehensive strategies of the government to control everything does not touch directly the competition policy. They can resist, they can live with competition law being implementing and being enforcing for years, but until the point that they have to left these areas public policy. But I think that in Argentina, in Peru, in other Latin American countries, they are working, and the competition policy has maybe deep roots because of the discussion in regulated sectors that are strong as telecom, as electricity and gas, and the competition matters are there, are in the public agenda, and maybe they could preserve the competition issues for a long more than in Venezuela, because the problem is the model. And in the institutional strength, I think that in Venezuela we had, but we are in a situation of total control of the public sector, of the powers, and the strength of our institutional framework is very compromised, and it is the reason because if you don't have economic freedom and private property, you cannot speak about competition. In the other countries, I think that they have space enough of private property and economic freedom. Thank you.
My question in this way is if the constitutional framework a very important role does play for us in Latin America, particularly because, for example, in Peru, in our constitution from 1993, Article 58 and 60 expressly state that the private activity from the state is limited, yes, only in the framework of subsidiary role. No? And it was a change for us because after several years from many public interventions, Yes, we can speak about the Constitution from 1979. It was a first step, but with the current Constitution we can see another scenario about public intervention. Thank you very much.
Daniel Zimmer from Bonn University. I was very impressed by both presentations, and I would like to pose two questions to our colleague Claudia Curiel Leidenz from Venezuela. The first question, you mentioned in your very clear presentation, which obviously contained a very frank statement, that you have had anti-monopoly law at an agency since 1991. And my first question is there any enforcement activity anymore after this new paradigm that you described has been implemented? The second is you very clearly stated that economic freedom is very much limited, has become very much limited recently in Venezuela, and economists would expect in such a situation that there is a important loss in welfare. My question is, can you observe that the living standard, in the sense of the material living standard in your country, has declined over the last years? Many thanks.
Paulo from University of Louvain, Belgium. So as I understand, in the situation of Venezuela, competition is declining, and as I understand from what Vicente was saying, we have competition in South America, in Peru, Chile, and Brazil. Is this due to the fact that the private sector in itself is not developed enough? We have been talking about competition between agencies and between parts of the ministries in China. We've been discussing competition in the private sector in all sorts of countries. And in this case, are we facing a kind of competition between the state or public organs on the one hand and the private sector? So these are my two questions to both, actually, and to other people also in the room.
Well, the Venezuelan constitution is very similar to the other ones regarding the private property principle, the prohibition of expropriations just under specific cases, and the limitation of the state participation in the economy. But the Venezuelan constitution has, you know, like Troja horse, because because at the end it says everything will be wonderful, but it depends of these social goals. And these social goals, the last part of these articles is enough to justify this institutional building or madness. You can choose the alternative. In Venezuela, they are discussing an anti-monopoly law project since 2005, and it says the state-owned enterprises are not in the scope of the law. The prohibition is just about the private monopolies, and they are trying by rules in banking sector to put a limit of 15% of market share to remain in the market. If you are more than that, you have to make a kind of divestiture in order to continue operating in the banking sector. And I feel and I believe that it is just the first step. And they will limit the structure of the markets in the rest. And the letter and the text of the Constitution is not the guideline here. Because it's their interpretation of the social goal what is relevant. About the enforcement, during the last 3 years, we don't have any case. If you go to the superintendency with a situation, they will not move. They don't understand. They don't care. The superintendent will talk you about the wonderfulness of socialism. And okay, the economic freedom is limited. The losses of welfare. Venezuela has a characteristic that I have is very important, and is oil. With oil in 115, it's impossible to expect that the Venezuelan economy will decrease. The Venezuelan economy depends on oil exports in 95%. And if the oil goes to $80, we will the economy will be affected. But if you don't have competition, we will not notice that. I would like to say that we have a measure, but the public information about economic activity was interrupted 3-4 years ago. We don't have serious to compare. At least the central banking, the macroeconomic data remains, but the other information about the economy is not was not continued. And regarding the question about competition is declining, and is the private sector developed enough? I think that it was. It was, but you cannot fight with an hegemonic state. You cannot fight with that, because it's not that you were not enough developed in order to provide what you offer, or to dealing with your own investment, or to manage your company. It is that if you are good enough, you will be in the agenda of the state, because you have to be mine, because you are a menace. If you are so good that you could take the control, or you can lead some sector, because the military view is that I cannot accept any rival in any area. Thank you.
Here in Brazil, we had from 1964 to 1985, 20 years of strong interventionism. And we had a military dictatorship, and the government used to intervene directly in price and wages. Then we had a competition authority, but it was formal. It didn't work. And after that, because of a high inflation process, the government, even in the democratic situation, continued to intervene in the same way, controlling prices and wages. Only in 1994, when we stopped the high inflation, this is the same year of the new competition law. Then we certainly can say that the competition process, the control of competition process started in Brazil in 1994. Then it's a very, very new process, and the society sometimes doesn't understand exactly, what's for, why do we need a competition authority? The same we can say about the regulatory agencies. We have our regulatory agencies were created in 1997 when we had a strong privatization process in telecommunications and parts of energy. And then the problem is, I think, in the politics, the elite of politics even in the right, independent of ideology, in the right or in the left, they have some old ideas about the intervention. They are not too much liberal. And this is a practice, a culture that's becoming important in our society in the last 10 years. Then it's normal, I understand that it's normal that the government does some pressure over the agencies to achieve its own goals. But I think the institutional development is changing this situation. And for example, the government Lula and the Workers' Party, when they took the power, they intended to stop the regulatory agencies. They wanted the government regulate directly the infrastructure service, and they changed part of their thoughts. And I think that we certainly, well, maybe a bit optimist that we are going going to a situation where the regulation will be part of the normal government intervention or state intervention.
Thomas Chen from the University of Hong Kong, and I have a question for, a few questions really, for Professor Barrionuevo about your analysis of, I guess, you have a slide where you show, I guess, I think you call it a positive profit and a negative profit, and the break-even point, or the point beyond which it would be unprofitable for the operators. And I was wondering, in your analysis, do you assume only one entrant in the market, two entrants, or do you provide for different scenarios? And also, when you calculate the distribution of coverage across different classes, do you assume that 10% coverage mandated will be distributed 2% in each class, or do you assume that there'll be selection? I mean, if I were the operator, I would just go for the most profitable, the wealthiest economic class, and I'm not sure it is such a bad proposition if you're required to cover the top 40% of the consumers. And also, did you allow for price discrimination among different classes? Because it seems that for cable service, price discrimination could be possible. I don't know how things work in Brazil, but how would that change your analysis? So,
Tem mais uma. We got one more question on this block. Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Yes, Christian Huvenex from the Belgian Competition Authority in Brussels. I would also like to raise a question to Professor Barrionuevo when it is in fact strongly related to the previous question of Professor Chen. Your model is very interesting, of course. It is showing that increasing the index of compulsory coverage, you have a negative effect on investment decisions, and you also incriminated the asymmetry in the regulation. And then you made a proposition that in fact the market would be capable of stimulating entry into more municipalities than in the case of imposing some compulsory coverage index. So my question is, what would be for you, let's say, a good regulatory framework? Would it be a framework based on competition between different infrastructures? For instance, competition between, on the one hand, cable operators, and on the other hand, DTH market players. So it's related to the question of Professor Chen, that is, would your model be adapted adapted to the case of several market players using...
First of all, the first question. We think about one more operator, and we did the follow calculation. We considered that, first of all, the households of A class are attended. Then the B, C, there's an order. Because these classes, well, the subscribers of classes A, B, and C have a positive contribution margin. Then, and we think, we used hypothesis that only a cable operator would supply in these cities. Then, the number we had, it's the maximum what we should with cable supply. We didn't consider DTH. Why? Because DTH is in all the country, because it's easier for the companies to supply the DTH than cable. But there's an issue of public policy that it's very important, the broadband. And we would like to know how much can the market increase the supply of broadband and pay TV service. Then then it depends on the proportion of classes A, B, C, D, and E. You in each city you will have or not, depends of the obligation of the investment obligation. You will have or not a new operator. Well, the second question, the new law of pay TV service, the SEAC, intended exactly to finish the distinction between cable and DTH and other technologies. Because in the past we had a lot of restrictions that applied only to cable operators. Then they had difficulties to compete with the DTH companies. And as the government understand and correctly that the cable operator is an agent to improve the supply of broadband, they try to eliminate this asymmetry. The problem here is that here in Brazil, and certainly in other Latin American countries, you have parts of the population that doesn't have income to buy even with the service of the broadband service or the pay TV service, even if the market were perfectly competitive. Then the kind of public policy we should have is a kind of subsidy, or to reduce the taxes, or to subsidy the investments. But the way that Anatel chose, that's a problem. To impose investment obligations in companies that have already made their investments.